On this morning. For most, it's probably a familiar text. Heard this text preached on a lot as a young man growing up, and this morning I was reading back through it in my personal devotions and just began to I just have some thoughts on it this morning, really just some things that as I was just meditating on this passage and just thinking about this morning. But 1 Kings chapter number 21, the Bible says, "And it came to pass after these things that Naboth the Jezreelite had a vineyard which was in Jezreel, hard by the palace of Ahab, king of Samaria." So we've got, again, I'm just going to kind of reiterate this a little bit this morning as we look at it. Here's Naboth, and he's got this vineyard, and it's right upside of the palace of the king. And the king, I can imagine, looks out at it. I can imagine as he looks, he sees Naboth working there. And we read on down, verse number 3, and Naboth said to Ahab, "The Lord forbid it that I should give the inheritance of my fathers unto thee." This piece of property is an heirloom of Naboth's. I can imagine Naboth as his grandfather, even his great-grandfather, maybe even his great-great-grandfather, working this piece of land, getting it ready, getting the vines ready, getting the grapes ready, removing the rocks out of the area, doing all the labor for it, preparing the soil, cultivating the soil, fertilizing the soil, getting all this labor into it. And I can imagine Naboth as he's going through here, looking and seeing all the labor of his, I don't know how old he remembered back in the generations, whether he was just alive for his grandfather or for his great-grandfather, but somewhere along the way, this piece of property became Naboth's. Somewhere along the way, and I can imagine even as a young man, Naboth maybe being out there with Grandpa, and Grandpa giving him some of those grapes and trying these, and because Grandpa had put the effort into it, the grapes, and I'm not talking about anything new this morning, but I just want to reiterate this because I want to see the value. I believe sometimes we lose the sight of the value of what we have. What's been fought for? What's been accomplished? I heard a statement just the other day. It was in reference to building programs and to going forward, and it was referenced in the fight and the hard work and the labor to get from point A to point B, and now from point B to the future. If it was hard work back then to get from point A to point B, what's it going to be for this next generation to get where God wants them? It's going to be work as well. And I believe that as Naboth walked into this vineyard, yes, Grandpa and great-grandpa and Dad had done a lot of the work. But I believe that somewhere along the way, just because of the generations that it was, that Naboth did some of the work as well. I believe that Naboth was out there and he learned that, hey, wait a minute. No, and when Ahab came to him, Naboth looked at him and said, "No, I've worked at this thing. No, I remember the labor. I remember the toil put into this. I remember all of these things." Reading a book, it's the memoirs of Clarence Thomas, if I remember correctly, the Supreme Court Justice. And just going back and looking at what all that he developed through in the 1970s, and you would think after he got out of law school he'd be having the money, but no, things were still tight. There's still the labor, and we look at it now and go, here's a man that sits on the United States Supreme Court, but if you look back and in his memoirs, he said, no, there was still hard times. And I wonder if Naboth didn't come along some hard times. I wonder if Naboth in this area of it, Naboth may have looked at Ahab when Ahab came, and he's talking to Naboth about it. Naboth goes, "You know what? I can pay off some debt. You know what? This thing, it's hard work right here to keep this vineyard up." But somewhere I believe in Naboth's mind, in verse number 2 and verse number 3, the Bible doesn't tell us. But I'd like to put some humanity to Naboth for just a moment. Because what would we do if we were in Naboth's shoes? And somebody comes up to us and we could ask them an outlandish price because they want it. And we go, hey, it's right here behind. Okay, we could ask double or triple the going rate. And they'd be willing to pay it because they've got the money. They'd be willing to pay it because they want it so bad. You look at the housing market the last 2 or 3 years. People were buying houses that weren't worth what they were buying them for. Because I want the house, I have the money, let's buy it. Our realtor that we worked with, he said, and he used this example, he said, there's an apple sitting here and you and I are saying, I'm only paying $1 for it, but somebody else from another part of the country comes in and says, well, we pay $5 for that same apple. Here, I'll give you $5 for it. Naboth, in this instance, he could have been one of those ones who goes, man, here's Ahab, he wants this bad enough. See, how much can I reasonably jack up the price and get out of Ahab? I'm on a little hard times right now. But somewhere in there, and I don't know if Naboth had already made up his mind, he said, no, I'm not going to do it. I'm not going to sell this piece of property. I remember all the hard work from years gone by that's put into this property, and I'm not going to sell it. As I was meditating on this morning, I began to think about this. What if Naboth had sold it? What if Naboth had sold it? Ahab comes to him in verse number 2, and Naboth says, you know what? Hard times right now. I'll tell you what. I'll sell it to you at this rate. In the back of his mind, he thinks, I'm going to be able to buy it back at the same price. Just a thought that I was thinking about this morning. Year, 2 years goes by, 3 years goes by. Ahab goes in there and he has hired his landscape crew and they've totally redone it. Naboth comes back to Ahab and says, hey, I'd like to buy back that piece of property. Ahab now looks at him, and I know I'm speaking hypothetically here, but I believe that we sometimes go this route in our lives. And you say, what do you mean? We sell off something that God has given us. And we come back after a period of time. We may come back after a few weeks, a few months, a few years and go, you know what? I want back what I used to have. And I got to thinking about Ahab being like Satan this morning, and just as a Christian and applying this to my life and applying this to us, as we look at this and we sell out to Satan, and then a year, 2 years down the road, we come back and go, Satan, I want that piece of property back. The problem is we're not going to get it at the same price. The problem is we're actually not going to be giving it back at all. If we want it back, we're going to have to fight for it. As I thought about this and thought about on through the story this morning of Naboth, how many Christians have sold out? And years later, they've come back and said, devil, I want the piece of property that I sold to you back. And Satan says, fine, I'll give it back to you, but it's going to cost you more than what you paid for it. And you think about this, and like I said, Ahab had brought in his landscape crew because he said, I want it for a garden of herbs. So Ahab comes in and he tears out everything that Naboth and his family had worked for. And he comes back in, and now Naboth gets it back. And I can imagine Ahab, if just by the wickedness of Ahab, the devil being the same way, before he sold it back, or if he knew that you had interest in it and were coming back to it, I could believe that Ahab or the devil, just represented, would go through and sow it with all kinds of weeds. All kinds of riffraff that would make life harder for you when you got through. I can imagine the devil going, you want it back? I'll give it back to you. And he goes and he gets all those stones that you had piled up and he spreads them back through. Just think about it. In our lives, and you say, well, what are those stones? Those stones may be addictions. Those stones may be hurdles and financial things and emotional things that we have to overcome to get that land back. Scars in our body that we've sold back, that we've given Satan that land. My friends, this morning, don't sell out. Better to die where you stand than to have to try to buy it back. You say, well, what happens if you die where you stand? You've had other people that say, you know what, the cost is worth the price. If you sell out on the other side of it, you sell out, somebody else may look at it and go, you know what? If they sold out, I can sell out as well. Well, again, the effect goes both ways. But here's the other catch on the other side of this. That person, when they get rid, they go, hey, they bought it back and they were able to take it back. And that other person that you've had that negative influence, that they sold out their piece of property as well. They come back in and they look at it and go, you know what? I don't want that back. Look at all the work you had to do to get back your piece of property. I'm not working back that far. I'm not putting all that back into there. And they continue to no longer serve the Lord because of the decision you made to sell out one day. But if you stop and think, and we go back to this, I'm glad that Naboth did not sell out that day. I'm glad that he looked at it and said, you know what? It's not for sale, Ahab. I'm glad that Naboth gives us the example throughout his life, in this one little story here that says, you know what? It's not for sale because the consequences of selling are far greater than the consequences of dying where I stand. I forget the mighty man of David that stood there over a field of beans and fought for it. He stood there as an example that, you know what, this is not for sale. This is worth fighting for. It's the field of beans. It's the sustenance of my people. What do we have in our possession that somebody has fought and died for, or fought for and plowed the row and has the great... When I think about this, when people look at Rock of Ages, they look at it and they see the property today, but what about where we used to be? See, it's very simple for this next generation to look at it and say, oh, look at what we've got. Don't have to fight for it. No, but we fought to get to where we're at today. We must continue to fight to get to where we're going to be tomorrow. And no matter where you're at, no matter what church you go to, no matter where you're at in your Christian walk, it's a continual fight and a continual day by day. Naboth saying, not for sale. Not today. I'm not giving it up. You say, why? Because so that you can, like Paul, say, I fought a good fight. I've finished my course. I've kept the faith. But not only that, so that young person coming in behind you says, they finished. They crossed the finish line. They completed their task. They didn't stop. Yes, they may have stumbled to the finish line because of old age, because of health, because of different things. They may not have crossed like a marathon runner. They may have crossed like one of those guys that just barely training for it, not a professional on it, but they still crossed the finish line. However they crossed, they still crossed. My friends, this morning, let's fight and let's remember that there are some things in our lives that should not be for sale. And no matter the price that's offered to us at the time, it's not worth it. Brother TJ, do we have a chorus this morning?